In 1932, a man in rural Oklahoma fed his family of 7 for an entire winter on $17. No grocery store, no government check. Every neighbor was just as broke. He did it with his hands, his land, and skills so ordinary that nobody had ever bothered to write them down. Today, most Americans cannot preserve a single jar of food and would not last 3 weeks if the supply chain stopped moving. Number 14 on this list was the single reason millions of families did not starve during the worst economic collapse in American history. Number 7 involves chemistry so precise that modern food scientists had to reverse engineer it from old farmwives' notes. And number 1, agricultural economists at the University of Nebraska confirmed in 2022 that families who used this method consumed more complete nutrition than most Americans do today on a full grocery budget. These are the survival protocols of an entire generation that refused to die. It took us less than 2 generations to lose every last bit of it. Before we start, hit that subscribe button, because what this generation knew about surviving without money is something no school has ever taught and no algorithm will ever show you twice. Let us count down the 20 Depression-era survival skills that Americans completely forgot. 20. Stretching a soup bone for a full week. 1 beef knuckle, a cast iron pot, a low simmer on the back of the wood stove. Day 1 produced a rich broth that the family drank from tin cups with a square of cornbread. The bone went back in. Day 2, dried beans that had been soaking overnight were added and the broth became a thick soup. Day 3, a fistful of barley and whatever root vegetable was left in the cellar. By day 5, the marrow had dissolved completely into the liquid, enriching everything with a fatty depth no modern stock cube has ever matched. By day 7, a family of 5 had eaten 7 distinct meals from the same bone for less than a dime. Modern science has since confirmed that long-simmered bone broth contains more bioavailable collagen, glycine, and minerals than most commercial protein supplements on the market today. The Depression grandmother who stretched a single bone for a full week was practicing precision nutrition without knowing a single word of biochemistry. Today, bone broth sells for $9 a carton at Whole Foods. The women who invented it got it for free from the butcher who was glad to give the bones away to anyone who would use them. 19. Ash cake baking directly in the coals. When a Depression family had no oven, no fuel to spare, and barely enough cornmeal to last the week, they baked in the fire itself. Ash cake was a thick patty of cornmeal, water, and salt, sometimes enriched with a spoonful of cracklins if any were available, wrapped tightly in wet corn husks and buried directly in the glowing coals of a dying fire. Within 30 minutes, the outside was charred completely black and the inside was perfectly steamed. The moisture in the husk created a cooking environment that regulated the temperature more precisely than any modern oven, making it nearly impossible to burn. Cherokee families had used this method for centuries before European settlers arrived in the southern mountains. Depression-era Appalachian families carried it forward without any sense that they were doing something remarkable. To them it was simply how bread was made when wood was too precious to fire a stove. Modern survival schools now charge $400 for weekend courses teaching this exact technique as an advanced wilderness skill. Your great-grandmother learned it on a Tuesday afternoon in 1933 because she had to eat. 18. Reading a field for free food. A Depression mother in Georgia could walk any ditch line or creek bank and come home with enough wild food to supplement 2 full meals at no cost. She knew that pokeweed shoots under 6 inches were edible if boiled through 3 complete changes of fresh water. 1 boil and you were poisoned, 3 and you were nourished. She knew that field cress grew in wet ditches from February through April and tasted exactly like watercress. She knew that wild garlic came up before anything else in March and could flavor an entire week of bean dishes. She knew that young dandelion leaves gathered before the plant flowered made a bitter, mineral-rich green that her children needed desperately after a winter of starchy root vegetables. She knew that cattail pollen in June could substitute for a quarter of the flour in any biscuit or pancake recipe. This was not foraging as a hobby. It was a systematic, multi-generational knowledge of the land refined through absolute necessity until it was as reliable as a grocery list. A foraging app can identify a plant, but it cannot tell you which specific ditch on which specific farm reliably produces field cress in a wet March, because that knowledge lived in one woman's memory and died when she did. 17. Rendering cracklins for every meal. Nothing left the hog. Every Depression family that kept a pig understood this as a moral principle as much as a practical one. An animal that had been fed through the winter was not to be wasted at any level. The fat trimmings that were not pure enough to render into clean lard were cut into small cubes and cooked low and slow in a heavy iron skillet for 4 to 6 hours until they turned hard, golden, and intensely flavored. A woman kept her cracklins in a stone crock on the back of the stove and used them the way a modern cook uses butter or olive oil, to fry eggs in the morning, to season beans, to enrich cornbread batter, to add body to a thin soup. A single hog's worth of fat trimmings, properly rendered, provided the primary cooking fat for a family of 6 for 4 full months. In a year when store-bought lard cost money nobody had and butter was a distant memory, the cracklin crock was not a luxury. It was the engine of the kitchen and the reason the family ate hot food every single day. 16. The cold water test for candy and preserves. No candy thermometers. No digital displays. A glass of cold water on the counter beside the stove and 40 years of experience reading what the syrup did when it hit that water. A thin thread that dissolved meant jelly stage. A soft ball that flattened between the fingers meant fudge. A firm ball that held its shape meant caramel. A hard ball that clicked against the glass meant taffy. A thin snap meant soft crack stage, right for certain brittles. A hard clean shatter meant hard crack, the stage for clear hard candy and peanut brittle. 6 distinct stages, each with a specific feel in the fingers and a specific visual behavior in the cold water, all memorized and cross-referenced against the color and smell of the bubbling pan. Culinary schools still teach this today as the foundational technique of professional confectionery science. The grandmothers who used it daily in 1932 did not learn it from any school. They learned it by burning 3 batches of jam and then paying very close attention to every batch that followed. 15. Vinegar making from apple scraps. Nothing from the apple harvest was wasted. Cores, peels, and bruised windfalls too damaged to store went into a large stone crock with enough water to cover them and a small amount of raw sugar to feed the fermentation. The crock was covered with cloth to keep flies out and allow wild yeast in. Within 3 weeks, the mixture had become a rough tart cider. Left alone for 6 more weeks, acetic acid bacteria converted it into sharp, complex apple cider vinegar with a depth that no commercial factory-produced vinegar has ever matched. Depression families used it to preserve vegetables, clean surfaces when soap was scarce, treat sunburn and insect bites, and break down the tough fibers in cheap cuts of meat that would otherwise be too chewy to eat. In 2023, raw apple cider vinegar sells for $12 a quart at natural grocery stores and is marketed as a premium health supplement. In 1933, a Depression farm family made it from apple peels that would have otherwise gone to the pigs, and they called it Tuesday. 14. The Victory Garden System, Depression style. This is the skill that kept millions from starving, and it bore no resemblance to what most modern people would recognize as a vegetable garden. Nothing was grown for pleasure or variety or interest. Every planting decision was calculated for maximum calories per square foot across a 12-month cycle with no gaps and no waste. Pole beans over bush beans because pole beans produced for 10 weeks where bush beans produced for 3. Sweet potatoes because they yielded more calories per square foot, grew in poor soil without fertilizer, and stored for 8 months without any treatment beyond keeping them dry. Winter squash in every available corner because a mature Hubbard squash could sit untouched in the cellar until March. Dill and pickling cucumbers because those 2 plants together produced the year's supply of pickles that replaced fresh vegetables entirely through the winter months. Every plant had a specific job, and every job connected to a specific season. The USDA estimated in 1934 that the average Depression-era kitchen garden produced over 70% of a family's entire caloric intake for the year. Today, the average American garden, when it exists at all, produces enough tomatoes to make salsa in August and gets abandoned when the weather turns cold. 13. Building a Haybox cooker from a crate and old blankets. Fuel was the hidden scarcity of the Depression, the one that did not make headlines but quietly shaped every meal a family ate. Every calorie of heat required to cook food had to be paid for in cash or labor, and many rural families had neither. The solution was the fireless cooker, the same technique pioneer grandmothers had used crossing the plains a generation earlier. Bring a pot of beans or soup to a full rolling boil for 15 minutes, ensuring the contents are heated completely through. Then nestle the covered pot inside a wooden crate packed tight on all sides with hay, old wool blankets, crumpled newspaper, or any insulating material available. Close the crate. Leave it entirely undisturbed for 4 to 6 hours. Open it to find fully cooked food still at serving temperature, having used no fuel whatsoever after that initial boil. The insulation simply trapped the heat already in the food and allowed cooking to continue on stored energy alone. Modern thermal cookers built on this exact principle sell for $150 to $250 at outdoor retailers. The Depression version cost nothing beyond a wooden crate and the knowledge. 12. The dripping pan and nothing wasted. Every modern kitchen produces a staggering amount of discarded fat without most people even noticing. Bacon grease down the sink. Roasting drippings in the trash. Fat skimmed from broth thrown out because it looks unappetizing. A Depression kitchen had a dripping pan on the back of the stove at all times, a shallow tin container that was never emptied and never cleaned, only added to continuously. Bacon drippings, chicken fat, pork chop grease, beef drippings from the Sunday roast, all of it accumulated into a layered, complex cooking fat with more depth than any single rendered fat alone. When the pan began to smell stale after several weeks, it was not discarded. It was heated slowly and strained through cheesecloth to remove the protein particles causing the rancidity, effectively resetting it for another 2 to 3 weeks of use. A University of Minnesota home economics study published in 1937 calculated that a family that maintained a dripping pan consistently saved approximately $11 per year in cooking fat costs alone. In 1937, that was 2 full weeks of a common laborer's wages, and in the Depression, 2 weeks of wages was the difference between making it through winter and not making it. 11. Wild yeast capture and the sourdough system. Commercial yeast was scarce and prohibitively expensive for many rural Depression families, particularly in isolated areas where the general store was 20 miles away and credit had long been cut off. The solution was the same system that had leavened bread for 10,000 years before Fleischmann invented his dried yeast packets in 1868 and convinced American housewives they needed to buy something their grandmothers had always made themselves. A farm wife kept the sourdough starter, a living culture of wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria, fed daily with a cup of flour and a cup of water at no additional cost beyond what she was already spending. Bread made with a healthy starter stayed mold-free for 2 to 3 weeks longer than commercial yeast bread, because the lactic and acetic acids produced during fermentation created an environment most spoilage organisms could not survive. Stale sourdough was never discarded, dried in the oven overnight. It became breadcrumbs for frying or a thickener dropped into thin soups in the last 10 minutes. The starter was treated with a care that bordered on the personal. Stories from the Depression years describe women who ran back into burning houses specifically to rescue the starter crock before anything else. 10. Repurposing flour sacks into clothing and household linens. By 1932, cotton flour sacks had become one of the primary textile sources for Depression families across the rural South and Midwest. Flour companies had begun printing their sacks in colorful calico patterns specifically to attract customers who had figured out that the sack the flour came in was worth as much as the flour inside. A woman who collected enough matching bags could produce a complete dress, a set of curtains, a pair of children's shorts, a set of dish towels, a pillowcase, all from the packaging of flour she was going to buy anyway. The skill required knowing which parts of a sack had been stressed by the weight of 50 pounds of flour during shipping, how to remove printed brand names by soaking in kerosene and washing with lye soap, and how to pre-shrink the fabric in hot water before cutting to prevent the finished garment from distorting after its first laundering. By 1937, the Textile Bag Manufacturers Association estimated over 3 million American women were regularly sewing from flour sacks, not as a craft project or a nostalgic activity, as the primary clothing supply system for their families, because there was no other option. 9. Medicinal herbs as the only healthcare system. A doctor visit in rural Depression America cost $1 to $3, money most families simply did not have. The result was that an older system of herbal medicine, which had been slowly retreating before commercial pharmaceuticals since the turn of the century, made a sharp comeback in the 1930s as the only healthcare available to millions of Americans. A Depression mother who knew her medicinal plants could treat infections with a raw honey and plantain leaf poultice, the same broadleaf weed that grows in every disturbed soil in North America. She could reduce a fever with elderflower and yarrow tea, compounds modern pharmacology has confirmed are genuinely effective fever reducers. She could clean wounds with diluted golden seal root tea, a natural antimicrobial that Johns Hopkins researchers documented as effective against Staphylococcus aureus in 2016. She could relieve headaches and rheumatic pain with white willow bark tea, which contains salicin, the exact compound Bayer synthesized into aspirin in 1899. She could not perform surgery or treat severe infections. But for the ordinary ailments that consumed the bulk of a rural family's healthcare needs through a depression winter, her knowledge was genuinely effective, widely practiced, and entirely free to anyone who knew where to look. 8. Bartering skills and labor for everything money could not buy. When the formal cash economy collapsed, the old barter network that had been the economic backbone of frontier America quietly reasserted itself across rural communities from Appalachia to the Great Plains. A farmer who could not pay his hardware debt spent 4 Saturdays mending the merchant's fence line, the labor worth more to the merchant than the cash equivalent because cash was useless when the supply chain had nothing to offer. A woman with no money for fabric traded 3 dozen eggs and a quart of cream per week through summer in exchange for 10 yards of calico from the dry goods store. A man with a crosscut saw hired himself out for firewood splitting in exchange for hay he needed far more than the wood. This economy required a completely different intelligence than cash trading, knowing the value of your own skills and goods not in dollars but in time, scarcity, and seasonal demand, and building the trust networks over years of reliable dealing that made the whole system possible. Communities that maintained these networks came out of the 1930s with stronger social fabric and measurably lower long-term poverty rates than those who had relied entirely on cash and found themselves with nothing when it disappeared. 7. The salt-sugar-smoke triangle of meat preservation. The Depression-era ham cure was not a recipe in any conventional sense. It was 3 preservation mechanisms working simultaneously, each targeting a different vulnerability of the meat, and a person who managed it had to understand all 3 well enough to adjust them based on the temperature of the cellar, the thickness of the cut, and the time available. Salt pulled moisture out of the muscle fibers through osmosis, creating a chemical environment too hostile for most bacteria to survive. Sugar fed specific lactobacillus bacteria already present on the meat's surface, which produced lactic acid that eliminated harmful organisms including Clostridium botulinum. Smoke deposited over 200 distinct antimicrobial phenolic compounds onto the surface while simultaneously drying the outer layer into a hard protective rind that sealed the interior. Food scientists at the University of Wisconsin studied traditional American cure formulas in 2019 and confirmed that the ratios passed down through depression families, 8 pounds of salt to 2 pounds of brown sugar per 100 pounds of meat, a day and a half of cure time per inch of thickness, fell precisely within the safe parameters modern food safety science would independently prescribe. The grandmothers got the chemistry exactly right without ever taking a chemistry class, without consulting a scientific paper, and without any equipment more sophisticated than a scale and their own hands. 6. Setting small game traps for year-round protein. When there was no money for meat at the store and no time for rifle hunting before the day's work began, a depression farmer set traps. The figure 4 deadfall required 3 sticks cut to specific lengths and notched at precise angles, locked together in a tension under a heavy flat rock so the trigger would fire on the light tread of a rabbit approaching the bait but hold steady against a gust of wind or the vibration of a passing wagon. A wire snare required a loop set at exactly the right height above a known game trail, 3 to 4 inches for rabbits, anchored firmly in position to appear completely natural to an animal whose entire survival depended on detecting anything foreign in familiar spaces. A man who had been working the same creek bottom and thicket edges for 20 years knew which specific locations reliably produced game across the seasons. He checked those 10 locations every morning before dawn and reset every trigger that had sprung empty. 2 to 4 rabbits per week. Protein for a family of 5 at a cost of nothing but wire and a knowledge of where to set it. 5. Dehydrating vegetables on tin sheets in the sun. Before commercial dehydrators, before electricity reached most rural homes, and before the mason jar made water bath kenning the American standard, the oldest and in many ways most effective preservation method was the simplest: direct sunlight and moving air. Green beans were blanched briefly in boiling water to stop enzymatic breakdown, then spread in a single layer on clean tin sheets laid flat on wooden sawhorses in the full August sun, brought inside before sunset each evening to prevent the night air from rehydrating the partially dried beans. Returned to the sun at first light. After 3 to 4 full days of direct summer sun, the beans had shrunk into paper-thin leather chips that snapped rather than bent, the sign that water content had been reduced to the point where microbial growth was effectively impossible. Stored in cloth bags hung from the kitchen rafters, those leather breeches lasted until the following summer with no further treatment and no investment beyond tin sheets and knowledge. The USDA confirmed in 2020 that sun-dried vegetables retain a higher concentration of heat-sensitive phytonutrients than either canning or commercial freezing, because the slow, low-temperature process does not apply the intense heat that degrades these compounds during high-temperature processing. 4. Building a community seed bank and selecting for survival. During the Depression, seeds were money in the most literal sense. A knowledgeable seed saver did not select from the biggest or most beautiful plants. He selected from the plants that had matured earliest in a cool spring, showed the best disease resistance in a wet year, maintained vigor deepest into a September dry spell when every other plant in the patch was failing. He knew that saving seed from the same inbred line for more than 5 or 6 generations produced measurable decline in germination rates and vigor, and that the solution was the quiet, deliberate exchange of seed with a neighbor whose different soil type, different drainage, and different aspect produced enough genetic variation to restore the hybrid strength the pure lines were gradually losing. That informal community seed exchange was, by any technical standard, a distributed plant breeding program of considerable sophistication, producing locally adapted open-pollinated varieties that outperformed anything a commercial seed catalog offered for those specific conditions. Almost all of those varieties are now extinct. The commercial seed industry that replaced them sells varieties that cannot produce viable seed for replanting, ensuring that every farmer who depends on them must return to the catalog every single year, permanently dependent in the most fundamental way possible. 3. Fermented foods as the entire gut health system. Stanford Center for Human Microbiome Studies published a 2021 review that surprised researchers who had gone in expecting to document the nutritional deficiencies of Depression-era poverty diets. What the data showed instead was that Depression-era rural populations living in the deepest poverty frequently showed better markers of gut microbial diversity, immune function, and resistance to inflammatory conditions than age peers who had grown up in more affluent circumstances with greater access to commercially processed food. The reason, once the dietary records were examined carefully, was straightforward: fermented food at every meal, not by philosophical choice but by preservation necessity. The sauerkraut crock in the cellar from September through April. The sourdough starter on the counter fed every single morning. The lacto-fermented pickles in their brine jar. The clabber milk that soured naturally in the springhouse and was eaten as breakfast. All of it delivering billions of live lactobacillus organisms at every meal, maintaining a microbial diversity that modern probiotic supplement companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars attempting to replicate in capsule form. The research increasingly suggests the diversity delivered through real fermented food is substantially greater than anything that can be packaged in a pill. 2. The cold smoke method for preserving fish and game. Families who lived near rivers and creeks had access to protein that cost nothing but time: catfish, crappie, and bass taken by trotline through the warm months, with the problem being not catching the fish but preserving them past the day they were pulled from the water. Cold smoking, operating at temperatures between 60 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, preserved meat through surface dehydration and antimicrobial smoke compounds without cooking the flesh at all. A Depression smokehouse with a fire trench dug into the ground outside and a clay pipe channeling barely warm smoke into a notched log building could preserve 100 pounds of fish over 2 weeks of continuous slow smoking using only hardwood scrap smoldering at a temperature so low the smoke was barely warm when it entered the building. Modern food scientists studying traditionally cold smoked products have identified over 200 distinct antimicrobial compounds in the smoke layer deposited by low-temperature hardwood smoldering. Electric smokers operating at 200 degrees produce approximately 30 of the same compounds. The chemistry of long, cool, smoldering hardwood smoke simply cannot be replicated by short, hot electric smoking regardless of how sophisticated or expensive the equipment. 1. The total self-sufficiency mindset. Planning 1 year ahead, wasting nothing, depending on no one. Every skill on this list was a component of something larger than any individual technique. A complete way of thinking about time, resources, and survival that the Depression generation had inherited from their pioneer grandparents and never been given the opportunity to forget. It was the habit of looking at every resource, every byproduct, every apparent waste product, and asking automatically, what can this become? The woman patching the flower sack dress already thinking about the quilt she would make from the scraps too worn to patch anymore. The farmer saving his best seed corn in a dry glass jar in October already planning the field that would not be planted until April and not harvested until the following October. The family who built the Haybox cooker already calculating the wood they would not burn this winter and how many more weeks it would last them. The USDA estimated in 1925 that the average American farm family was 90% self-sufficient in food. By 2023, that number is estimated below 2%. In less than one human lifetime, We dismantled the survival system that took 300 years to build and replaced it with a supply chain so efficient in good times and so fragile in bad ones that a 3-week disruption would put most American families in a food crisis more severe than anything the Depression generation ever faced. They called it just living. We would call it a miracle. Here is my challenge. Do not try to learn all 20 of these skills at once. You will overwhelm yourself and learn none of them well. Pick one, just one, and start it this month. If the soup bone sounds manageable, buy a knuckle from a butcher this week and see how many days of meals you can stretch it across. If the sourdough starter sounds interesting, try to capture one from the wild yeast in your own kitchen flour and keep it alive for 30 days. If the fermented vegetables appeal to you, buy a head of cabbage and a box of pickling salt and put up 1 crock of sauerkraut before the month is out. Then come back and tell us in the comments what you tried, what worked, and what surprised you about it. Because these skills were not hobbies. They were the operating system of an entire civilization, tested under conditions of genuine catastrophe and proven equal to those conditions by the families who practiced them. That civilization was our grandparents and our great-grandparents. The knowledge they carried in their hands and their heads was meant to come to us. Most of us are only beginning to understand how much of it we let go, and how much work it is going to take to get it back.